The Hauptstrecke Hamburg to Lübeck add-on was made by Dovetail Games and released in May 2021, which was back in the TSW2 era. This route is not new to the TS series, as it is a debatably necessary remake of a route we've already got in TS Classic. Personally speaking, I don't like the route myself, and I'm going to explain why, but if you're still able to enjoy it, that's perfectly fine. In my opinion, this is one of the weakest German routes in TSW, but it is not the worst, thankfully. The reasons why I don't like Hamburg to Lübeck are thus. The route is only 63 kilometres, or 39 miles long, with only one freight-only branch line, and it runs through very dull and unremarkable terrain. As boring as the original TS version was, at least Dovetail went back and extended the Hamburg S-Bahn coverage to include the entire S1 line. You don't even get a basic AI-only model of the BR474 with the TSW version, let alone an entire line on the S-Bahn network. Only the little and completely empty section running right alongside the main line between Hamburg Hauptbahnhof and Hasselbruck. This DLC only includes 2 locomotives, a small selection of freight wagons that I know nothing about, which are probably just reused from existing add-ons, and the overused Doppelstockwagen coaches. The passenger locomotive is the Deutsche Bahn BR112, which looks very similar to the BR143, while the freight locomotive is the MRCE ES64U2 Taurus. The MRCE locomotive is really just a reskin of the DB BR182 that we already have. Interestingly, this route has the longest Doppelstockwagen coaches I've seen in TSW, with the BR112 somehow managing to haul 7 of those things at up to 160 km per hour. Besides the default BR112 and ES64U2 locomotives, motive power from other add-ons will also appear on this route in timetable mode. Examples include the BR363 and Vossloch G6 diesel shunters, with the G6 essentially being a modern equivalent of the BR363, as well as the BR146/2 electric locomotive from Main-Spessartbahn. While it's good to see these other locomotives running on Hamburg to Lübeck, I don't know how many of them actually run on this line in real life. I can't comment on the accuracy of the station models, because I am not familiar with this line in real life, but I will say that I kind of like the way Hamburg Hauptbahnhof looks, as it reminds me of the old Hamburg to Hanover route in TS Classic, although it's still very quiet in-game for what is apparently Germany's busiest railway station. I question why Dovetail chose to make Hamburg to Lübeck, of all lines, as a TSW route, given its rather mediocre nature. As one would expect from a Taurus, this MRCE locomotive has that iconic musical sound from the traction motors, even if they are just reused from the older BR182 add-on. For all I know, these sounds may not be entirely accurate, but the locomotive still sounds like a Taurus to me. Just not the U4 variant, which sounds very different to the U2. Driving this thing is quite interesting, because she accelerates as fast as an EMU when she's running light engine. But when she's hauling a heavy freight train, the acceleration is nerfed. Realistic physics are much appreciated. This black Taurus still has passenger door controls in the cab, which furthers my belief that this is just a reskin of the existing BR182 model, especially since I would have thought that freight engines wouldn't need door controls. The BR112's sounds are pretty much just copied and pasted over from the BR143. I don't know too much about German locomotives in real life, and consequently can't verify how accurate the in-game sounds are for either the BR143 or BR112. Something I can tell you is that there were 130 examples of the BR112 built in the early 1990s, in stark contrast to over 600 BR143s, which first appeared in 1985. The reason why the BR112 is slightly faster is because, at the time of the class's construction, the lines into and out of Berlin were being upgraded to handle speeds higher than 120 km per hour. I don't particularly like driving the BR112 from either the locomotive herself or the cab car, but I'm fine with this rolling stock being on this line since it was prototypical. Although the BR218 diesel was the main passenger locomotive in the original TS Classic version, not the BR112. The way you drive the BR112 is borderline identical to the BR143, complete with the unusual speed controller instead of a conventional throttle. I've only seen two major differences between the BR112 and BR143, namely the light clusters and top speed. The 143 can only go as fast as 120 km per hour, while the 112 can reach 160 km per hour. As for the cab car, this thing does have a conventional throttle, and it's always placed at the Hamburg end of the train. But the most annoying part of driving from this end is just how overpowered the whole thing feels, with speeding being a common occurrence as a result. The brakes are quite annoying as well, because they feel too strong and take too long to release, which is hardly ideal when you're trying to adjust your speed or stop exactly on the marker at a station. Some of the asset placement is fairly dodgy, as indicated by the tree and bush that are way too close to the track just west of Ahrensburg station. The tree is so close that a branch clips right through the locomotive or cab car's cab. Other examples of lazy route building that I noticed include this catenary mast just east of Hamburg Hauptbahnhof that's far too close to the track. Your guess as to how Dovetail screwed this up is just as good as mine. As well as the subpar grass detailing between Ahrensburg and Hamburg Rahlstedt. Some of the services that you can run with the BR363 or Vosloch G6 involve shunting coaches at Lübeck. But this work involves going into a depot of some kind, and the interior of this building is very poorly detailed. And for some reason, the NPCs still walk over to, and stand on, the disused part of the platforms at Kupfermühle. The frame rate normally hovers around 60 to 90 FPS throughout most of the route, but it can get quite laggy at Hamburg Hauptbahnhof, dropping down to 30 or 40 FPS, due to the increased number of trains present. And a similar issue is present at Bremen Hauptbahnhof as well. Now this might sound really dumb, but my biggest issue with this add-on is the fact that it exists in the first place. The rail scene is really no better than the boring and linear route. Most of the time it only really comprises the same old Doppelstockwagen coaches hauled by BR112s with the occasional freight service to boot. Then there's the fact that it takes less than an hour, more specifically only around 44 to 50 minutes, to cover the full route in the BR112, given the 160 km/h top speed and the limited number of intermediate stops. There are a sizable number of stations on this line, but the RE8 and RE80 services, the only ones that go all the way to Lübeck, barely stop at any of them. The RB81 service does call at more stations, but terminates early at Ahrensburg, Bagterheide, or Bad Oldesloe. Looking at photographs of the real RE80 service, I saw that they did indeed use BR112 locomotives and Doppelstockwagen coaches on this route in real life, but these were replaced in early 2023 by Stadler KISS electric multiple units. While you do see other locomotives and units layered in at Hamburg Hauptbahnhof, sold separately of course, most of them do not appear on the rest of the line out to Lübeck. A rare exception comes in the form of a few services with the Deutsche Bahn BR406 or ICE 3M, which is included with the Köln to Aachen route, and the BR146-2 that I mentioned earlier will sometimes appear on DB Regio services instead of the usual BR112. One especially noteworthy train that's absent from the TSW version is the Danish State Railways IC3, a strange-looking DMU that apparently ran international services from Hamburg to Copenhagen via Lübeck. And incidentally, I wouldn't mind seeing a Danish route in TSW, or anything outside the usual UK, US and Germany trio, for that matter. Hamburg to Lübeck was kind of like a precursor to Bahnstrecke Bremen to Oldenburg, as that is another needlessly short route through bland and unremarkable terrain. Although both routes have short branches that go off to a freight yard, they still feel very linear because of how little there is to do. But I will say that I prefer the Bremen route over Hamburg to Lübeck, solely for the more interesting rolling stock that it includes, especially the BR110-3 and N-Wagen coaches. I find that a lot of German routes in TSW just feel very samey, because all but one of them are electrified, and most are purely functional with the same generic mix of passenger and freight services present. What I mean by purely functional is thus: a lot of these routes have very little in the way of interesting scenery, and are just there for people and freight to get from point A to point B in a timely manner. There are very few, if any, German routes in TSW that have truly great scenery on par with Ruhrsieg Nord, Main-Spessartbahn, and the Niedertalbahn. Not helping the situation is the fact that most of these routes are very linear. While I do like to see a busy and varied rail scene, as is the case with the Riesa to Dresden route, I still don't like driving through boring terrain like what you see on the Leipzig S-Bahn, Köln to Aachen, München to Augsburg, Hamburg to Lübeck, and especially Kassel to Würzburg. I can't decide which is the most important aspect for me: a good and varied rail scene with lots of different motive power, or nice and scenic terrain. I'm not saying that people aren't allowed to enjoy Hamburg to Lübeck as it is now, but I still think that Dovetail should have made a more interesting line, and what they gave us in this add-on just isn't good enough. If you're looking to buy a German route in TSW3, I suggest Ruhrsieg Nord, Main-Spessartbahn, Dresden to Chemnitz, or the Niedertalbahn instead. Those routes may all be fairly short, but at least they ran through much more scenic environments than Hamburg to Lübeck.